she put on her clothes in 5 minutes. She knew a small way she could unbolt herself, and she flew downstairs in her stocking feet and put on her shoes in the hall, and chained and unbolted and unlocked, and when the door was open she sprang across the steps with one bound, and there she was, which seemed to have turned green, and with the sun pouring down on her and warm, sweet wafts floating and twittering and singing, coming from every bush and tree. She clasped pure joy and looked up in the sky, and it was so blue and pink and pearly and white and springtime light that she felt as if she must flute and sing aloud herself, and knew that robins and skylarks could not possibly help it. She ran around towards the secret garden. It was all different already, she said. The grass leaves are sticking up everywhere, and things are uncurling, and green buds of leaves are showing. The sure Dickon will come. The long, warm rain had done strange things to the hedge beds which bordered the walks by the lower wall. There were things sprouting and pushing the roots of clumps of plants, and there were actually here and there glimpses of royal yellow unfurling among the stems of crocuses. 6 months before Mistress Mary would not have seen how the world was waking up, but nothing. When she had reached the place where the door hid itself under the ivy by a curious loud sound, it was the caw of a crow, and it came wall, and when she looked up, there was a big glossy plumaged blackbird looking down at her very wisely indeed. She had never seen a crow so far, and he made her a little nervous, but the next morning, the moment he flapped away across the garden. She hoped he was going to stay inside, and she pushed the door open. When she got fairly into the garden, she saw that he probably did intend to stay, because on a dwarfed apple tree, and under the apple tree, was lying a little reddish animal with a bushy tail. Both of them were watching the stooping body and rust-red head of Dickon, kneeling on the grass, working hard. Mary flew across the grass to him. "Oh, Dickon, Dickon, how could you get here so early? How could you? The sun has only just got up himself, laughing and glowing, and tousled, his eyes like a bit of sun. He said, I was up long before him. How could I have stayed abed? The work begun again this morning, it has, and it's working and humming and scratching and pipe building and breathing out sense till you've got to get out and on it instead of lying on your. When the sun did jump up, the moor went mad for joy, and I was in the midst, and I run like mad myself, shouting and singing, and I come straight here. I couldn't away. Why, the garden was lying here waiting." Mary put her hands on her chest, panting and running herself. "Oh, Dickon, Dickon," she said, "I'm so happy I can scarcely breathe." Seeing him talking to a stranger, the little bushy-tailed animal rose from its place under the tree to him, and the rook cawed once, flew down into its branch, and settled quietly on his shoulder. "This is the little fox cub," he said, rubbing the little reddish animal's head. "And this here's Soot. Soot, he flew across the moor with me, and Captain, he run same as the hounds had been after him. They both felt safe." Neither of the creatures looked as if they were the least afraid of Mary. When Dick about, Soot stayed on his shoulder, and Captain trotted quietly close to his side. "See here, see how these is pushed up, and these, and look at her." He threw himself upon his knees, and Mary went down beside him. They had come upon the crocuses burst into purple and gold. Mary bent her face down and kissed them. "You never kiss a person in that way," she said when she lifted her head. "Flowers are so different." He looked puzzled but smiling. He said, "I've kissed Mother many times that way when I come her after a day's roaming, and she stood there in the door in the sun, looking so glad." They ran from one part of the garden to another, and found so many wonders they were obliged to remind themselves that they must whisper or speak low. He showed her swellings and rose branches, which had seemed dead. He showed her 10,000 new green through the mold. They put their eager young noses close to the earth and sniffing springtime breathing. They dug and pulled and laughed low with rapture until her hair was as tumbled as Dickens, and her cheeks were almost as poppy red as his. There was every joy on earth in the secret garden that morning, and in the midst of them, more delightful than all, because it was so wonderful. Swiftly, something to the wall and darted through the trees to a close-grown corner. A little flare, red-breasted bird, with something hanging from its beak. Dick stood quite put his hand on Mary's, almost as if they had suddenly found themselves laughing in a tree. We munnot stir, he whispered in broad Yorkshire. We munnot scathe. I knowed he was a mate hunting when I seed him last. It's been he's building his nest. He'll stay here if us don't flight him. They settled down softly upon the grass and sat there without moving. Seem as if us was watching him too close, said Dickon. He'd be out with us for good if he's got the notion us was interfering now. He'll be a good till all this is over. He's setting up housekeeping. He'll be shyer and readier to take things ill. He's got no time for visitin' and gossip. Us must keep still a bit and try to look as if us was grass and trees and bushes. Then, when he's got used to seeing us all chirp and bit, and he'll know us is not in his way. Mistress Mary was not at all sure what she knew, that she didn't seem to, how to try to look like grass and trees and bushes. But he had said the queer thing as if it were the simplest and most natural thing in the world, and she felt it must be easy to him. And indeed she watched him for a few minutes carefully, wondering if it was possible for him to quietly turn green and put out branches and leaves. Got wonderfully still, and when he spoke, dropped his voice to such a soft furious that she could hear him, but she could. It's part of the springtime, it Eldon is, he said. I warrant it's been going on the same way every year it has begun. They've got their ways of thinking and doing things, and a body and not metal. You can lose a friend in springtime easier than any other season if you're too curious. If we talk about him, I can't help looking at him, Mary said softly. We must talk of something else. There is something I want to tell you. He'll like it better of something else, said Dickon. What is that got to tell me? What do you know about Colin? She whispered. He turned his head to look at her. What does that? He asked. I've seen him. I have been to talk with him every day this week to come. He says I'm making him forget about being ill and dying, answered Mary. Dickon looked actually relieved as soon as the surprise died away from his round face. That, he exclaimed, I am right down glad. It makes me easier. I knowed I must say him, and I don't like having to hide things. Don't you like hiding the garden? I never tell about it, he answered. But I says to Mother, I says, I got a secret and it's not a bad un. Thou knows that. It's no worse than hiding where a bird's nest doesn't mind it, does that? Mary always wanted to hear about the mother. What did she as if not at all afraid to hear? Dickon grinned sweet-temperedly. It was just like her, she said, he answered. She gave my head a bit of rub and laughed and says, lad, thou can have all the secrets thou likes. I've knowed thee 12 years. How did you know about Colin? Asked Mary. Everybody as knows about Master Craven knows there was a little lad as was like to be a cripple, and they knowed Master like him to be talked about. Folks is sorry for Master Craven because Mrs. Craven was such a lady, and they was so fond of each other. Mrs. Medlock stops in our cottage whenever she goes to Thwaite, and she doesn't mind talking to Mother before us children, because she knows us was being brought up to be trusty. How did that about him? Martha was in fine trouble that last time she came home. She said that her and thou was asking questions, and she didn't know what to say. Mary told him her story, Wuthering of the Wind, which had wakened her, and about the faint, far-off sound in the voice which had led her down the dark corridor with her candle, and it ended with her opening of the door of the dimly lighted room with the coaster bed in the corner. When she described the small ivory white face and the strange black eyes, Dickon shook his head. Them's just like his mother's eyes, only hers were always light, he said. They say as Mr. Craven can't bear to see him wake, and it's because his eyes is so like his mother's, and yet looks so different in a bit of a face. Do you think he wants to die? Whispered Mary. No, but he wished he'd never been born. Mother, she says that's the worst thing, child. Them as is not wanted scarce ever thrives. Mr. Craven, he'd buy anything as money could buy for the poor lad that he'd like on earth. For one thing, he's afraid he'll look at him one day and find he's grown. Colin's so afraid of it himself that he won't go crazy and scream. He oughtn't to lie there thinking about such things, said Dickon. No lad could get well as thought them sort of things. The fox was lying in the grass, close, looking up to ask for a pat now and then, and Dickon bent down and rubbed his neck softly and thought a few silence. Presently he lifted his head and looked around the garden. When first we got in here, he said, it seemed like everything was grey. Look round now and doesn't see a difference. Mary looked and caught her breath a little. Why, she cried, all is changing. It's as if it was a green mist were creeping over it. It's almost like a gauze veil. Aye, said Dickon, and it'll be greener and greener till the grown. Cannot guess what I was thinking. I know it was something nice, said Mary. I believe it was something about Colin. I was thinking that if he was out here, he wouldn't be to grow on his back. He'd be watching for buds to break out of the rose bushes. I know, fear, explained Dickon. I was wondering if us could ever get him in the humour to come out here and lie under the trees in this carriage. I've been wondering that myself. Every time I've talked to him, said Mary. I've wondered if he could keep a secret, and I've wanted to bring him here without anyone seeing us. I thought perhaps you could push his carriage. I must have fresh air, and if he wants us to take him out, no one dare disobey him. He won't go out for other people, and perhaps they will be glad if he will go out with us. He could order the gardeners to keep away so they wouldn't find out. Dickon was thinking very scratched Captain's back. It'd be good for him, I'd warrant, he said, thinking he'd better never been born. Us'd be children watching a garden grow, and he'd be another. Two lads and a little lass just looking on at the springtime. I warrant it'd be better than doctor's stuff. He's been lying so long, and he's always been so afraid of his back that it has made him queer. He knows a good many things out of books, but he doesn't know anything else. He's too ill to notice things, and he hates going out of doors and hates gardens and gardeners. But he got this garden because it is a secret. I daren't tell him much, but he said it. Us'll have him out here sometime for sure, said Dickon. I could push his carriage well enough. Has I noticed how the robin and his mate has been working while we've been sitting here, and perched on that branch, wondering where it'd be best to put that twig he's got in his beak. He made one of his low whistling calls, and the robin turned his head and looked at him inquiringly. Swig. Dickon spoke to him as Ben Weatherstaff did, but Dickon's tone was one of phrase. Where thou puts it, he said, it'd be all right. Thou know done this before, and that come out of the egg. Get on with thee, lad. Got no time to lose. Oh, I do like to hear you talk to him, Mary said, laughing delighted. Weatherstaff scolds him and makes fun of him, and he hops about and looks as if he understood every word. He likes it. Ben Weatherstaff says he is so conceited he would rather have stones thrown than not be noticed. Dickon laughed too and went on talking. Thou knows us won't, he said to the robin. Us is near being wild things ourselves. Us too, bless thee. Look out that doesn't tell on us. Though the robin did not answer, because his beak was occupied, Mary knew that when he flew away with his twig to the corner of the garden, the darkness of his dew-bright eyes meant that he would not tell their secret for the world. Chapter 16. I won't, said Mary. They failed to do that morning, and Mary was late in returning to the house, and was also in such a hurry to get to work that she quite forgot Colin until the last moment. Tell Colin that I can't come and said to Martha. I'm very busy in the garden. Martha looked very frightened. Hey, Miss Mary, she said, It may put him all out of humor when I tell him that, but Mary was afraid of him as other people were, and if she was not a self-satisfied. I can't stay, she answered. Dickens waiting for me, and she ran away. It was even lovelier and busier than the morning had been. Already nearly all the weeds were cleared out of the garden. The roses and trees had been pruned or dug about. Dickon had brought us in, and he had taught Mary to use all her tools, so that by this time the lovely little place was not likely to become a gardener's garden. It would be a wilderness before the springtime was over. There'll be blossoms and overhead, Dickon said, working away with all his might, and peach and plum trees and bloom against the wall, and the grass will be a carpet of flowers. The little fox and the rook were as happy and busy as they were, and the robin and his mate flew backward in tiny streaks of lightning. Sometimes the rook flapped his black wings over the tree tops in the park. Each time he came back and perched near Dickon and cawed as if he were relating his adventures, and Dickon talked to him just as he had talked to the robin. Once Whiddon Dickon was so busy that he did not answer him at first, so to his shoulders and gently tweaked his ear with his large beak. When Mary wanted to go, Dickon sat down with her under a tree, and once he took his pipe out of his pocket and played the soft notes, and two squirrels appeared on the wall and looked and listened. A bit stronger than I was, Dickon said, looking at her as she was digging. I was beginning to look sore. Mary was glowing with exercise and good spirits. Fatter and fatter every day, she said, quite exultantly. Mrs. Madlocks will have to get me bigger dresses. Martha says my hair is growing thicker. It isn't so flat and stringy. The sun was beginning to set and sending deep golden rays slanting under the trees when they were parted. It'll be fine tomorrow, said Dickon. I'll be at work by sunrise, said Mary. She ran back to the house as quickly as her feet would carry her. She wanted to tell Dickon's fox cub and the look and about what and the rook and about what time had been doing. She felt sure he would like to hear. So it was not very pleasant when she opened the room to see Martha standing waiting for her with a doleful face. "What is the matter?" she asked. "What did Colin say when I told him I couldn't come? When you told him I couldn't come?" Said Martha. She had gone. He was nigh going on into one of his tantrums. There'd been a night all afternoon to keep him quiet. He would watch the clock all the time. Lips pinched themselves together. She was no more used to considering other people than Colin. She saw no reason why an ill-tempered boy should interfere with the things she liked best. Nothing about the pitifulness of people who had been ill and nervous, and who did not know that they could control their tempers and need not make other people ill and nervous too. Said when she had had a headache in India, she had done her best to see that everyone else also for something quite as bad. And she felt she was quite right. But of course, she felt that Colin was quite wrong. He was not on his sofa when she went into his room, lying flat on his back in bed, and did not turn his head toward her as she came in. Bad beginning, and Mary marched up to him with her stiff manner. "Why did you get up?" she said. "I did not get up this morning when I thought you were coming. I did get up this morning when I thought you were coming," he answered without looking at her. "I made them put me back in bed this afternoon. My back ached and I was tired. Why didn't you come?" "I was working in the garden with Dickon," said Mary, and condescended to look at her. "I won't let that boy come and stay with him instead of coming to talk to me," he said. Mary flew into a fine. She could fly into a passion without making a noise. She just grew sour and obstinate at what happened. "If you send Dickon away, I'll never come into this room again." "You'll have to if I want you," said Colin. "I won't," said Mary. "I'll make you. They shall drag you in." "Shall they, Mr. Rajah?" said Mary fiercely. "Drag me in, but they can't make me talk when they get me here. I'll sit and clench my teeth. Tell you one thing, I won't ever look at you. I'll stare at the floor." They were a nice pair as they glared at each other. If they had been two little street boys, they would have sprung at each rough and tumble fight. As it was, they did not. They did the next thing to it. "Thing," said Colin. "What are you?" said Mary. "Selfish people always say that. Selfish who doesn't do what they want. Anyone is selfish who doesn't do what they want. You're more selfish than I am. You're the most selfish boy I ever saw." "What?" snapped Colin. "I'm not as selfish as your fine Dickon is. He keeps you playing in the dirt when I'm all by myself. He's selfish, like if you like." Mary's eyes flared. "He's nicer than any other boy who ever lived," she said. He's like It might sound rather silly to say that, but she did not care. "A nice angel," ferociously. "He's a common cottage boy off the moor." "Better than a common," retorted Mary. "He's 1,000 times better." Because she was the stronger of the beginning to get the better of him. The truth was that he had never had a fight with anyone like life, and upon the whole it was rather good for him, though neither he nor Mary knew about that. He turned his head on his pillow and shut his eyes, and a big tear ran down his cheek. He was beginning to feel pathetic and sorry for himself, not for else. "I'm not as selfish as you because I'm always ill, and I'm sure there's a lump on my back," he said, "and I'm going to die besides." "You're not," contradicted sympathetically. He opened his eyes quite wide with indignation. He had never heard it said before. He was at once furious and slightly pleased, if both at one time. "I'm not," he cried. "I am. You know I am. Everyone says—" "I don't believe it," said Mary sourly. "You just say that to make people sorry. Out of it. I don't believe it. If you were a nice boy, it might be true, but you're too nasty." In spite of his invalid back, Colin sat up in bed in quite a healthy rage. "Out of the room!" he shouted, and he caught hold of his pillow and threw it at her. He was not strong enough to bar, and it only fell at her feet. But Mary's face looked as pinched as a nutcracker. "I'm going," she said, "and I won't come back." She went to the door, and when she turned around and spoke again. "I was going to tell you all sorts of nice things," she said. "He's brought his fox and his rook, and I was going to tell you all about them. Now I won't tell you a single—" She marched out of the door and closed it behind her. And there, to her great astonishment, the trained nurse, standing as if she had been listening, and more amazing still, was a big, handsome young woman who ought not to have been a trained nurse. She could not bear invalids, and she was always making excuses to leave Colin to Martha or anyone in her place. Mary had never liked her, and she simply stood and gazed up at her as she stood giggling. And "What are you laughing at?" she asked her. "At the two young ones," said the nurse. "The best thing that could happen to the sickly pampered thing, to have someone to stand to him that's as spoiled as himself." And she laughed into her handkerchief again. "If Vixen of a sister to fight with, it would have been the saving of him." "Is he going to die?" "I don't know, and I don't care," said the nurse. "Hysterics and temper are half what ails him." "Hysterics?" asked Mary. "You'll find out if you work with him into this. But at any rate, you've given him something to have hysterics about, and I'm glad of it." Mary went back to her room, not feeling at all as she had felt when she had come in from. She was cross and disappointed, but not at all sorry for Colin. He had looked forward to telling him a great many things, and she had meant to try to make up her mind whether it would trust him with the great secret. She had been beginning to think it would be, but changed her mind entirely. She would never tell him, and he could stay in his room and never get over and die if he liked. It would serve him right. She felt so sour and unrelieved that for a few minutes she almost forgot about Dickon and the green veil creeping over the world and the soft wind blowing down. Martha was waiting for her, and the trouble in her face had been replaced by interest and curiosity. There was a wooden box on the table, and its cover revealed that it was full of neat packages. "Mr. Craven sent it to you. It looks as if he's had picture books in it." Mary remembered that he had asked her the day she had gone to his room. "Do you want anything? Dolls?" She opened the package, wondering if he had sent a doll, and also wondering what to do with it if he had. But he had not sent one. There were several beautiful such as Colin had, and the two of them were about gardens. and two of them were about gardens full of pictures. There were two or three games, and there was a beautiful little writing case with a gold knight and a gold pen in each stand. Everything was so nice that her pleasure began to crowd out of her mind. She had not expected him to remember her at all, and her hard little heart warmed. "I can write better than I can print," she said, "and the first thing I shall write will be a letter to tell him I am much obliged." If she had been friends with would have run to show him her present at once, and they would have looked at the pictures and read some of the cards, and perhaps tried playing the games, and he would have enjoyed himself so much he wouldn't have thought he was going to die, or have put his hand on his spine to see if there was a lump growing. He had a way of doing that which she could not bear. It gave her an uncomfortable feeling, because he always looked so frightened himself. He felt even quite a little lump some day he should know his hunch had begun to grow. Something he had heard Mrs. Medlock whispering to the nurse had given him the idea he had thought over it in secret until it was quite firmly fixed in mind. Mrs. Medlock had said his father's back had begun to show its crookedness, and that when he was a child he had never told anyone but Mary that most of his tantrums, called them, grew out of his hysterical hidden fear. Mary had been silent when he had told her. He always began to think about it when he was tired, she said to herself, and he has been cross today. Perhaps he has been thinking about it all afternoon. She stood still, looking at the carpet and thinking. "I said I would never go back again," she hesitated, knitting her brow. "But perhaps, just perhaps, I will go and see if he wants me in the morning. Perhaps he'll try to throw his pillow at me again, but I think I'll go." Chapter 17. A Tantrum. She had got up very morning and had worked hard in the garden, and she was tired and sleepy. So as soon as Martha had burnt and she had eaten it, she was glad to go to bed. As she laid her head on the pillow, she murmured, "I'll go out before breakfast and work with Dickon, and then afterward, I believe." She thought it was the middle of the night when she was awakened by such dreadful sound. She jumped out of bed in an instant. What was it? What was it? The next minute, sure, she knew. Doors were opened and shut, and there were hurrying feet in the corridors, and someone was screaming at the same time, screaming and crying in a horrible way. "Colin," she said, "having one of those tantrums the nurse calls hysterics. How awful it sounds!" As she listened to the sobbing screams, she did not wonder that people were so frightened that his own way in everything rather than hear him. She put her hands over her ears and fell shivering. "I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do," she kept saying. "I can't." Once she wondered if she would stop if she dared to go to him, and then she remembered having her out of the room and thought that perhaps the sight of her might make him worse. Even with her hands more tightly over her ears, she could not keep the awful sounds out. She hated them so, terrified by them, that suddenly they began to make her angry, and she felt as if she would like to fly into herself and frighten him, as he was frightening her. She was not used to anyone's tempers but her own. She took her hands from her ears and sprang up and stamped her foot. "Ought to be stopped. Somebody ought to make him stop. Somebody ought to beat him," she cried out. She heard feet almost running down the corridor, and her door opened, and the nurse came in. "Now, by any means." She even looked rather pale. "He's working himself into hysterics," she said. "He'll do himself harm. No one can do anything with him. You come and try. He's like a good child. He likes you." "He turned me out of the room this morning," said Mary, stamping her foot with the stamp rather pleased the nurse. The truth was that she had been afraid she might crying and hiding her head under the bedclothes. "That's right," she said. "You're in the right. You go and scold him. Give him something new to think of. Do go, child, as quick as you ever." It was not until afterward that Mary realized the funny as well as dreadful. That it was funny that all the grown-up people were so frightened at the little girl just because they guessed she was almost as bad as Colin herself. She flew to the corridor, and the nearer she got to the screams, the higher her temper mounted. She felt quite wicked to reach the door. She slapped it open with her hand and ran across the room to the four-poster bed. "Stop!" she almost shouted. "You stop! I hate you! Everybody hates you! I wish everybody would run out of the house and let you scream yourself to death! You will scream yourself to death! I wish you would!" A nice, sympathetic child could neither have thought nor things, but it just happened that the shock of hearing them was the best possible thing for his whom no one had ever dared to restrain or contradict. On his face, beating his pillow with his hands, and he actually almost jumped around. He turned at the sound of the furious little voice. His face looked dreadful, white and red and swollen, gasping and choking. But savage little Mary did not care an atom. "If you scream," she said, "I'll scream too, and I can scream louder than you can, and I'll frighten you." He actually had stopped screaming because it startled him so. The scream, which had been coming, almost choked him. The tears ran down his face, and he shook all over. "I can't stop," he gasped and sobbed. "I can't! You can!" shouted Mary. "Half what ails you is hysterics and temper. Hysterics, hysterics!" And she stamped each time she said it. "I felt it," choked out Colin. "I knew I should. I shall have a hunch on my back, and then I shall—" He began to writhe again, and turned on his face and sobbed and wailed. He didn't scream. "You didn't feel a lump," contradicted Mary fiercely. "If you did, it would only a hysterical lump. Hysterics make lumps. There's nothing the matter with your horrid thing but hysterics. Turn over and let me look at it." She liked the word hysterics and felt as if it had an effect on him. He was probably like herself, and had never heard. "Nurse," he commanded, "come here and show me his back this minute." Nurse Mrs. Medlock and Martha had been standing huddled together near the door, staring at him, mouths half open. All three had gasped with fright more than once. The nurse came forward, half afraid. Colin was heaving with great breathless sobs. "Perhaps he won't let me," she hesitated in a low voice. Colin heard her, gasped out between two sobs, "Show her! She'll see them." It was a poor thing, a thin back to look at when it was bared. Every rib could be counterpoint of the spine. Though Mistress Mary did not count them as she bent over them with a solemn, savage little face. She looked so sour and old-fashioned that her head aside to hide the twitching of her mouth. There was just a minute's silence. Colin tried to hold his breath, while Mary looked up and down his